If you ever wake up beside the one person you promised yourself you'd never fall for, don't look at them first. Look at your own hands, because sometimes the smallest thing is the hardest to explain. That was the first thought that crashed into my pounding head before I even opened my eyes. My mouth tasted like stale cola and mint gum. My temples pulsed with a dull ache, and sunlight poured through unfamiliar gray curtains that glowed with the soft warmth of a Sunday morning. For one blissful second, I convinced myself I was still dreaming. Then I felt the steady rise and fall of someone breathing beside me. Every muscle in my body locked. Slowly, almost mechanically, I turned my head. Ethan Brooks was asleep inches away from me. His dark hair was a complete mess, one arm resting loosely across the blanket between us. His expression so peaceful it barely resembled the confident architect who always had every detail of life under control. My heart skipped so violently it actually hurt. Ethan was my best friend. He had been my best friend for more than 10 years. He was also the one person I had spent 7 years secretly loving without ever expecting anything in return. And somehow, after one party I barely remembered, I had woken up in his bed. No, 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 no. I whispered under my breath, trying not to panic. I searched my memory for anything after arriving at Dylan's birthday party. Music, neon lights, someone handing me another drink, Ethan laughing because I kept losing at darts, rain outside. After that, nothing. Absolutely nothing. I carefully lifted the blanket, expecting to find some obvious clue that explained why I was here, but instead I noticed something even stranger. I was wearing one of Ethan's oversized college t-shirts, the faded navy one he always refused to throw away because it was too comfortable to die. I stared at it in complete confusion. I had definitely not arrived at the party wearing this. My own shirt was draped over the back of a chair across the room, wrinkled but neatly folded. Ethan would absolutely fold clothes. That detail somehow made everything even more confusing. I swung my legs over the edge of the bed as quietly as I could. The hardwood floor felt cool beneath my feet. Maybe I could leave before either of us had to explain whatever had happened. Maybe this was all completely innocent. Maybe I had simply been too drunk to get home. I took one cautious step before something caught my attention. There was a silver-colored ring around my left ring finger. It wasn't expensive. It looked like something from an arcade prize machine, polished enough to shine, but obviously fake. My pulse instantly doubled. Tiny engraved letters wrapped around the inside. I twisted it until the words caught the sunlight. Forever starts today. My stomach dropped. I didn't own this ring. Ethan had never worn jewelry. So why was it on my hand? You're awake. Ethan's sleepy voice drifted across the room. I turned so quickly, I nearly lost my balance. He was sitting up now, rubbing one eye before his gaze settled directly on the ring. Every trace of sleep disappeared from his face in less than a second. His expression froze. Not surprise. Not confusion. Something quieter. Something almost impossible to hide. Before I could ask a single question, he looked away and said in a voice that sounded carefully rehearsed, "Looks like neither of us remembers much about last night." I stood there with the cheap silver ring pressing against my finger while Ethan disappeared into the kitchen without another word, leaving me alone with questions that multiplied faster than I could think. A minute later, he returned carrying 2 mugs of coffee exactly the way he always made them. Black for himself, vanilla creamer, and 2 packets of sugar for me. The familiar routine should have been comforting, but instead it only reminded me that something about this morning felt completely unfamiliar. He handed me the mug with a faint smile that never reached his eyes. "Headache?" he asked. I nodded. "Feels like someone replaced my brain with wet cement." He let out a quiet laugh, the first genuine sound either of us had made since I woke up. Same. We sat across from each other at his tiny kitchen table in complete silence, the morning sun stretching across the hardwood floor. Usually, Ethan filled every quiet moment with jokes or random facts he had read online. Today, he stared into his coffee as if the answer to everything was hiding inside the cup. Finally, I held up my left hand. "Do you know where this came from?" His eyes lifted for only a second before drifting away again. "No," he answered too quickly. "I figured you already had it." I frowned. I have never owned a ring in my life. Another silence settled between us. It was not awkward because we lacked things to say. It was awkward because we were both choosing the wrong things. I reached for my phone on the counter. The battery had somehow survived the night. There were dozens of messages from friends asking if we had gotten home safely, but nothing unusual. Then I opened my photo gallery. It was almost empty after 10:30 the previous evening. One blurry picture of a pizza box. A completely black image that looked like someone had accidentally covered the camera lens. Then nothing. That cannot be right, I muttered. Ethan looked over. What? Everything after the party is gone. His expression barely changed, but I noticed his fingers tighten around the coffee mug. Mine too. We exchanged our phones without saying a word. His gallery ended exactly the same way. His text messages contained an unfinished conversation with Dylan that simply stopped at 11:14. My last message to my sister read, "Having fun. Do not wait up." After that, complete silence. I opened my voice recorder out of habit, expecting nothing. Instead, one file appeared near the top. It was only 3 seconds long. My pulse jumped as I pressed play. Static crackled through the speaker. There was distant laughter, footsteps, and then my own voice, breathless and almost whispering. "Do not let me." The recording ended abruptly before the sentence finished. I played it again and again. The missing words felt more important than the ones I could actually hear. Ethan slowly reached for his own phone and checked the same application. His eyes widened almost imperceptibly before he turned the screen toward me. His recorder was completely empty. Every file had been deleted. Before I could ask why, my attention shifted to something tucked beneath the edge of the kitchen counter. It was a folded receipt from an all-night arcade downtown, printed at 2:38 in the morning. The total came to $12.50. Prize tokens redeemed, 1 ring. I looked from the receipt to the ring on my finger, then back to Ethan. He inhaled quietly, as though he had finally remembered something important, but instead of speaking, he simply whispered, "That should not be possible." The ride back to my apartment lasted barely 15 minutes, yet it felt longer than some entire years of my life. Ethan insisted on driving because, according to him, neither of us was thinking clearly enough to be trusted behind the wheel. Usually we filled every drive with terrible singing, debates about movies, or arguments over which coffee shop made the best cinnamon rolls in the city. This time the radio stayed low, and neither of us seemed brave enough to interrupt the silence. Before I climbed out of his truck, he looked at me for a long moment. "If you remember anything," he began before stopping himself. "Call me." I forced a smile. "You will be the first person I call." He nodded once and drove away before I even reached my front door. The rest of Sunday should have been ordinary. I answered emails from clients waiting for illustration revisions, watered the dying fern my sister insisted I could keep alive, and attempted to sketch a children's book character that somehow ended up looking suspiciously like Ethan. Every 5 minutes my eyes drifted toward the silver ring still resting on my desk. I had taken it off as soon as I got home, but I could not bring myself to throw it away. Around noon my phone buzzed. Ethan had sent a picture of a breakfast sandwich with the caption, "You forgot to eat." It was the kind of message he had sent hundreds of times before, yet now I stared at it, as if every word carried a hidden meaning. I replied with a thumbs-up emoji because anything longer felt dangerous. Monday morning arrived with the comforting rhythm of routine. My favorite neighborhood coffee shop smelled exactly the same as always, rich espresso mixed with fresh pastries, and for a few minutes I almost convinced myself the strange weekend had never happened. Then Ethan walked through the door. We always met here before work on Mondays. That had been our tradition for years. He smiled when he saw me, but it was smaller than usual, careful instead of effortless. We exchanged an awkward half-hug that ended almost as soon as it began. Neither of us seemed to know where our hands belonged anymore. "Sleep any better?" he asked. "Not really." "Me neither." We both laughed, but the sound faded almost immediately. While waiting for our drinks, our fingers brushed as we reached for the same packet of sugar. Normally one of us would have made a joke about synchronized brain cells. Instead, we both pulled back so quickly that the barista glanced up in confusion. The silence followed us outside. Ethan offered to walk me the 2 blocks to my studio, something he had done countless times before, but every passing second felt heavier than the last. As we stopped at the crosswalk, a cheerful voice called my name. I turned to see Lucas Morgan from the publishing company waving from across the street. He jogged over with an easy grin and asked if I was still interested in grabbing lunch later that week to celebrate finishing our latest project. Before I could answer, Ethan spoke first. "He has been pretty busy lately." Lucas looked from Ethan to me, politely confused. I was actually asking Noah. I noticed Ethan's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. Right, he said quietly. Of course you were. Lucas smiled and handed me his business card with his personal number written on the back. Think about it. After he walked away, I slipped the card into my pocket without saying anything. We stood there watching the traffic until I finally broke the silence. Why did you answer for me? Ethan kept his eyes on the changing traffic light. I do not know. It was the first time in 10 years that I realized my best friend was lying to my face, and somehow that frightened me far more than the missing memories ever could. Lucas's card stayed in my wallet for 3 days before I finally sent him a message. I told myself it was nothing more than a professional lunch between coworkers, yet my finger hovered over the send button for almost a full minute before I gathered enough courage to tap it. He replied less than 30 seconds later with a cheerful suggestion to meet at a small Italian cafe downtown on Friday afternoon. It sounded harmless. Normal. Exactly the kind of thing I should have been able to do without overthinking every possible consequence. Somehow, it still felt like I was doing something wrong. By Thursday evening, Ethan stopped by my apartment carrying takeout containers from our favorite burger place, just as he had done dozens of times before. We watched half of a baseball game with the television playing mostly as background noise while neither of us paid much attention to the score. Every few minutes, I caught him glancing toward the silver ring sitting on the bookshelf beside the television. Neither of us mentioned it. Finally, as we cleaned up the empty containers, I decided I was tired of pretending everything was fine. I am having lunch with Lucas tomorrow, I said as casually as I could manage. Ethan froze with a paper napkin still in his hand. Oh, that single word sounded strangely heavy. That is good. He seems nice. He does. Another silence. Then Ethan walked to the sink and turned on the faucet much harder than necessary. Water splashed across the counter while he stared at the running stream instead of looking at me. You barely know him, he said quietly. That is usually how meeting new people works. He shut off the water and finally turned around. Just be careful. I folded my arms. Careful of what? His answer came almost immediately. People are not always who they seem. I could not help letting out a short laugh. That sounds ironic coming from someone who keeps telling me he cannot remember last Saturday. The color drained slightly from his face. He opened his mouth as if he wanted to respond, then closed it again. Forget I said anything, he murmured before leaving earlier than usual. Friday arrived with clear skies and warm weather, the kind that made the city feel lighter. Lucas was exactly as friendly as I remembered from work. He asked about illustration projects, favorite movies, my family, and somehow managed to make 2 hours disappear without a single awkward pause. It was easy, comfortable, refreshingly uncomplicated. As we stepped outside after lunch, Lucas smiled and said, I am glad you came. You smile a lot more than you do at the office. Before I could answer, a familiar truck rolled to a stop across the street. Ethan climbed out, holding a long cardboard tube under one arm. His expression shifted the instant he saw Lucas standing beside me. Noah, he called, forcing a polite smile. I was in the neighborhood. I brought the blueprints you wanted to see. I blinked in confusion. I never asked for blueprints. Ethan glanced at the cardboard tube as if he had only just noticed it himself. Right? I thought you might find them interesting. Lucas looked between us with an amused smile. Should I come back another time? No. Ethan answered before I could speak. Actually, yes, I said at the exact same moment. The awkward overlap hung in the air. Lucas gave me an understanding nod, excused himself, and walked toward the parking garage. I watched him disappear before turning back to Ethan. You drove 20 minutes across town with architectural drawings I never requested. What? Ethan stared at the empty sidewalk for several long seconds before speaking so softly I almost missed it. Because I did not like seeing someone else make you smile. He looked genuinely surprised by his own words, as if they had escaped before he could stop them. And for the first time since that forgotten night, I realized neither of us was the only one struggling to understand what had changed. The words Ethan had spoken stayed with me all weekend, echoing through every quiet moment like a song I could not turn off. Because I did not like seeing someone else make you smile. If anyone else had said something like that, I would have called it flirting. Coming from Ethan, it only left me more confused. On Monday morning, I could not concentrate on work. So instead of pretending to be productive, I decided to chase the only clues we had left. During my lunch break, I drove back to the downtown arcade listed on the receipt we had found in Ethan's kitchen. It was exactly the kind of place teenagers crowded into on Friday nights, filled with bright lights, old pinball machines, and rows of claw games that looked impossible to win. The manager, a cheerful man in his 60s wearing a faded company polo shirt, smiled politely when I showed him the receipt. "That was last Saturday," he asked while checking the register history. "Looks like 2 prize tokens were redeemed around 2:30 in the morning. Do you remember who used them?" I asked, knowing it was a long shot. He scratched his chin before snapping his fingers. "Actually, maybe. The place was almost empty by then. 2 young guys were laughing over by the prize machines. One of them kept insisting the silver ring looked luckier than the gold one." My heart skipped. "Which one?" He laughed. "I could not tell you that. They were both smiling too much for me to notice." As I thanked him and turned to leave, something caught my eye near the photo booth tucked into the back corner of the arcade. A small sign read, "Digital copies available for 30 days. My pulse quickened. I hurried back to the counter and asked whether old booth photos could still be retrieved. A few minutes later, the manager returned holding a printed strip that had never been picked up. "These belong to your friends?" he asked. I could barely breathe as I took the photographs into my hands. In the first picture, Ethan and I were laughing so hard that neither of us was looking at the camera. In the second, I was holding up the cheap silver ring while pretending to admire it. In the third, Ethan was looking at me instead of the lens. Not smiling, just looking at me with an expression I had never seen before. Soft, careful, almost afraid. The fourth picture made my entire world stop. I was reaching for his hand, not because I had lost my balance, not because I was joking. I was simply holding it. There was nothing romantic or dramatic about the moment, yet something inside my chest tightened as another fragment of memory suddenly surfaced. Rain tapping softly against the arcade windows. My own voice, unsteady but unmistakable. "Promise me, if I ever tell you something that ruins everything, you will still stay." Ethan had squeezed my hand before answering. "I am not going anywhere." The memory vanished as quickly as it had appeared, leaving me standing in the middle of the arcade with tears threatening to form for reasons I still could not explain. I stared at the third photograph again. Ethan was not looking at the camera because he had been looking at me, not as a best friend casually sharing a funny moment. Not with pity, not with confusion. There was something else in his eyes, something I had somehow missed for years. Then I turned the photo strip over. Written neatly across the back in Ethan's unmistakable handwriting were 6 simple words that made my heartbeat thunder inside my ears. He finally smiled after telling me. The drive to Ethan's apartment felt strangely familiar, as though my hands already knew the route even while my mind was desperately trying to catch up. I kept replaying the words written behind the photo strip until they lost all meaning and became nothing more than sounds inside my head. He finally smiled after telling me. Telling him what? I already knew the answer before I knocked on Ethan's door. I simply needed to hear him say it. He opened the door almost immediately, as if he had been standing on the other side waiting for me. The moment his eyes landed on the photographs in my hand, the color slowly faded from his face. Neither of us spoke for several long seconds. Finally, I stepped inside and placed the photo strip on the kitchen counter between us. "You remember," I said quietly. It was not a question. Ethan closed his eyes for a brief moment before letting out a slow breath. Yes. That single word landed heavier than every mystery we had been chasing all week. "You never lost your memory." He shook his head. "No." I stared at him, waiting for an explanation that should have come days ago. Instead, he walked to the window, folded his arms, and looked out at the quiet street below. "I wanted to tell you," he said. "Every hour since Sunday morning, I wanted to tell you." "Then why did you not?" His shoulders rose and fell with another deep breath. "Because you were drunk that night, Noah. Not completely out of control, but enough that I could not trust whether your feelings belonged to the moment or to the alcohol." My chest tightened. What did I say? Ethan looked at me with an expression I had never seen before, equal parts hope and regret. "You told me you had been in love with me for years." The room became impossibly still. Somewhere outside, a car horn echoed through the neighborhood, but it sounded distant, as though the entire world had stepped back to let those words settle between us. A second memory broke through without warning. We were standing outside the arcade beneath the glowing streetlights while rain fell in soft sheets around us. My voice trembled as I laughed nervously. You are the only person I have ever wanted to come home to. Ethan had taken off his jacket and draped it over my shoulders before answering with a smile I had completely forgotten. You already are home. The memory vanished, replaced by the present. What happened after that? I whispered. Ethan swallowed hard. You asked if I felt the same. My heart pounded so loudly I could barely hear my own breathing. And he smiled sadly. I told you the truth. Tears gathered in my eyes before I even realized it. You said yes. He nodded once. I told you I had been trying to convince myself for years that you were only my best friend. I told you every serious relationship I ever had failed because none of them were you. I searched his face for any sign that he was joking, but there was only quiet honesty. Then why did everything change the next morning? Ethan looked down at his hands. Because after I answered, you started falling asleep on the drive home. When we got here, you barely remembered what we had talked about. You looked at me and asked if I would promise not to let you make any life-changing decisions while you were drunk. His voice cracked for the first time. You made me promise, Noah. I felt another fragment slide into place. My own unsteady handwriting across the back of my hand. Ask him what he promised. I had known I would forget. I had tried to leave myself a reminder. Ethan continued softly. I kept every promise except one. I promised I would tell you everything when you woke up. Instead, I got scared and pretended I remembered nothing at all. For several seconds, neither of us moved. The apartment that had always felt warm and familiar suddenly seemed too quiet to breathe inside. I looked at Ethan, searching for the person I had trusted with every secret since I was 15, and I realized the mystery that had haunted me all week was no longer the missing memories. The mystery was how someone who loved me could look me in the eyes every day and pretend none of it had happened. You should have told me, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Ethan nodded immediately. I know. You let me believe I imagined everything. I know. You watched me question myself over and over again. His eyes closed for a moment as though every word landed exactly where it deserved. I know. I shook my head, trying to stop the frustration building inside my chest. Do you have any idea what that felt like? I thought I had embarrassed myself. I thought maybe I had crossed a line that destroyed the only friendship that ever really mattered to me. Ethan stepped forward before stopping himself halfway, leaving several feet between us. I never wanted you to feel that. But you did. He lowered his head. Yes. There was no excuse in his voice. No attempt to defend himself. Only regret. Somehow that made everything hurt even more. I picked up the little silver ring from the counter and rolled it slowly between my fingers. You said you were afraid my feelings only existed because I had been drinking. I was. Then why did you not ask me again the next day? Ethan looked at me with tired eyes. Because I was terrified you would tell me that sober Noah did not love me at all. I stared at him in disbelief. So you decided for both of us. He swallowed hard. I convinced myself that if I stayed quiet, I could protect what we already had. I laughed once, but there was no humor in it. You were protecting yourself, Ethan. He did not argue. That silence was all the confirmation I needed. I walked toward the door, needing space more than answers. Ethan finally spoke again, his voice breaking with quiet honesty. I have spent years thinking that telling you how I felt would ruin our friendship. I rested my hand on the doorknob without turning around. You know what ruined it? I asked. Not your feelings. Not mine. The lie. The words hung between us like something fragile that had finally shattered. When I opened the door, Ethan called my name one last time. I looked back. He was standing exactly where I had left him, shoulders slumped, eyes filled with the kind of sadness that comes from realizing the damage cannot be undone with a simple apology. I will wait, he said quietly, however long it takes. I do not expect you to forgive me today. I only want you to know that every word I told you that night was real. I wanted to believe him. Part of me already did. That was what made walking away so difficult. Over the next 2 weeks, I stopped answering his messages. Every morning, my phone lit up with a simple text. Good morning. I hope you have a great day. Every evening, another one appeared. Sleep well. No pressure to reply. I never did. Instead, I buried myself in work and accepted another invitation from Lucas, who never asked uncomfortable questions or forced conversations I was not ready to have. Yet every time I laughed with someone else, every time I reached into my pocket and accidentally touched the little silver ring I still could not throw away, I remembered the expression on Ethan's face when he admitted the truth. For the first time in 10 years, my best friend was no longer the person I called when life became confusing, and somehow that silence hurt far more than the forgotten night ever had. 2 more weeks passed before I saw Ethan again, and it happened in the last place I expected. My publisher had invited me to display a collection of illustrations at a small community art exhibition downtown, something I had spent almost a year preparing for. The centerpiece of the gallery was a series called The Missing Hours, 12 watercolor paintings that explored forgotten moments, unfinished conversations, and the strange emptiness left behind when memory refuses to cooperate. Almost no one knew the real reason I had chosen that theme. Lucas arrived first, carrying a small bouquet of white daisies because he remembered me mentioning they had been my mother's favorite flowers. He congratulated me with an easy smile and quietly wandered through the gallery, stopping to admire each painting without trying to analyze it. Being around him felt peaceful. There was no pressure, no complicated history, no unanswered questions. I had almost convinced myself the evening would pass without surprises when the room suddenly became unusually quiet. I turned toward the entrance and saw Ethan standing there in a navy button-down shirt with his hands tucked awkwardly into his pockets. He was alone. My heart reacted before my mind had time to stop it. Lucas followed my gaze and immediately understood who he was. "I can give you two some privacy," he offered gently. I shook my head. "You do not have to leave." Ethan slowly approached, stopping several feet away. His eyes drifted across the paintings before settling on the largest canvas in the room. It showed two empty coffee cups sitting across from each other by a rain-covered window, with one chair pulled back as though someone had just walked away. The title card beneath it simply read, "Still Waiting." Ethan smiled sadly. "That one is about us, is it not?" I did not answer. Instead, I folded my arms and waited. He took a slow breath before turning toward the small group of friends and co-workers gathered nearby. "I need to say something," he announced, his voice steady despite the nervousness I could hear beneath it. Every conversation in the gallery faded into silence. Ethan looked at me only once before addressing everyone else. "A few weeks ago, I lied to the person who has mattered more to me than anyone else in my life. I told him I could not remember an important night because I was afraid of what telling the truth might cost me." No one interrupted. "The truth is that I remembered everything. I remembered his honesty. I remembered my own. I remembered making promises that I later broke because I thought fear was safer than vulnerability." He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and carefully placed a small cardboard box on the display table beside my paintings. "I am not here to ask for forgiveness," he continued. "I am here because he deserves the truth without conditions." I slowly opened the box. Inside were the photo booth pictures from the arcade, the folded receipt for the prize ring, the tiny voice recorder I had accidentally left in his truck that night, and beneath everything else lay a sealed envelope with my name written across the front in Ethan's familiar handwriting. "I wrote that letter the morning after," he said softly. "I never gave it to you because I convinced myself silence would protect us. I was wrong." My hands trembled as I looked at the envelope, but I did not open it. Ethan gave me one final, gentle smile. "Whether you ever read it or not is your choice now. That choice should have been yours from the beginning." Without waiting for an answer, he turned, thanked the gallery owner for allowing him to interrupt the evening, and quietly walked toward the exit. Just before he reached the door, I noticed something I had somehow missed until that moment. The silver ring was no longer on my finger. It was resting inside the open box beside the letter, and beneath it was a small handwritten note that I had never seen before. It read, "The next promise belongs to you." I did not open Ethan's letter that night. I carried it home, placed it beside the little silver ring on my kitchen table, and simply sat there as the city lights slowly faded beyond my apartment window. For the first time since that forgotten Saturday, there were no more mysteries left to solve. I knew what had happened. I knew what Ethan had said. I knew why he had lied. The only question that remained was whether two people could find their way back after trust had been broken. I finally unfolded the letter just before sunrise. The paper was slightly wrinkled, as though he had opened and closed it countless times before sealing it away. His handwriting was as neat as ever. He wrote that he had fallen in love with me long before he understood what that feeling meant. He wrote that every apartment he had ever considered renting was judged by one ridiculous question first. Would Noah like this neighborhood? He admitted that every promotion he accepted, every vacation he planned, and every future he imagined somehow included me before anyone else. Then came the sentence that refused to leave my mind. I was never afraid of loving you. I was afraid that telling you would give me one perfect day and cost me a lifetime with my best friend. I read those words over and over until tears blurred the page. A week later, I found myself standing outside the community swimming center where Ethan coached children every Saturday morning. Through the glass wall, I watched him patiently encourage a nervous little boy standing at the edge of the pool. "You do not have to be fearless," he told the child with a gentle smile. "You only have to trust that someone will be there when you are ready." The boy nodded, stepped into the water, and Ethan stayed beside him the entire time. I smiled despite myself. Some people never stopped being exactly who they were. When the lesson ended, Ethan walked into the lobby carrying a towel over one shoulder. He froze the instant he saw me. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Finally, I held out the small silver ring resting in the palm of my hand. "I think this belongs to both of us," I said. He looked at the ring before meeting my eyes. "Does this mean you forgive me?" I shook my head gently. Forgiveness is not something that happens all at once. His expression fell slightly, but he nodded with quiet understanding. I stepped one pace closer. "It does mean I believe you were telling the truth that night. And I believe you are telling the truth now." Relief softened every line of his face. "Where do we go from here?" he asked. I smiled for what felt like the first completely honest smile in weeks. "We stop pretending we have to skip to the ending." He let out a quiet laugh. "So, coffee. An actual first date," I corrected. "One that both of us will remember." Nearly a year later, I woke to soft morning sunlight spilling across a familiar bedroom. The scent of fresh coffee drifted through the apartment while someone quietly hummed in the kitchen. I stretched, smiled, and reached toward the nightstand where the silver ring rested beside a framed photo from the old arcade booth. Ethan appeared in the doorway carrying 2 mugs and raised an eyebrow with playful curiosity. "Do you remember last night?" he asked. I laughed as I accepted the coffee from his hands. Every single second. He leaned his forehead gently against mine for just a moment before smiling back. "Good," he whispered. "Because from now on, I want all of our best memories to be the ones we choose together." Outside, the city was just beginning to wake, but inside our little apartment the morning felt wonderfully familiar. Not because history had repeated itself, but because this time there were no forgotten promises, no hidden truths, and no fear left standing between 2 best friends who had finally chosen to remember every step of the road they walked together.